The screaming ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving in its wake a silence that seemed somehow louder than the sound itself. The women in the drawing room remained frozen in their seats, teacups suspended in mid-air, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile membranes separating civility from chaos. It was Margaret Thornfield who moved first, rising with the deliberate slowness of someone performing an action that required absolute concentration. Her face had assumed the pallid quality of old porcelain, and her hands, folded before her, trembled with a violence she could not quite suppress. She did not speak, but her eyes sought Adrian's across the table, and in that glance passed something wordless but unmistakable, a communication that existed beneath language, in the realm of blood ties and shared history. Adrian had already begun to stand, his chair scraping backward with a sound that seemed explosively loud in the stillness. Constance reached out to grasp his wrist, her manicured fingers closing around the fabric of his sleeve with what appeared to be desperation, but he withdrew from her touch with a movement that was gentle but utterly final. The head mistress, a Miss Catherine Winters, was the first to give voice to the communal anxiety, her question tumbling out in a breathless rush. What on earth was that dreadful noise? Had someone fallen? Should they send for the doctor? Her words seemed to break the spell that had held the room in suspension. Violet Carmichael set down her teacup with careful deliberation, the china clicking softly against the saucer, and announced that she would go to investigate, her tone brooking no argument, as if her years as the wife of the late Dr. Carmichael had granted her some permanent authority over matters of medical concern. She rose with considerably less grace than Margaret had managed, her joints stiff with age, and made her way toward the door. It was at this moment that Miss Marple, who had remained so still and silent throughout the preceding minutes that one might have forgotten her presence entirely, set down her own teacup and folded her hands in her lap with the air of someone settling in to wait for inevitable developments. Her pale eyes had taken on a quality of sharper focus, though her expression remained one of mild, almost befuddled concern, the sort of expression one might adopt upon hearing an unexpected sound at a garden fete. The corridor beyond the drawing room stretched in both directions, illuminated by windows that looked out upon the overgrown gardens where roses had begun their autumn decline. The library lay directly ahead, accessible by way of a short passageway that was lined with portraits of deceased Thornfields, all of them regarding the living world with expressions of austere disapproval. Violet Carmichael proceeded down this passage, with Adrian close behind her, his face now flushed with what might have been anger, or might have been fear. The distinction was not immediately apparent. When they reached the library door, they found it standing slightly ajar, though neither of them had any recollection of seeing it open when they had passed this way an hour before. The room beyond was shadowed, for the heavy velvet curtains had been drawn against the afternoon light, and it took several moments for their eyes to adjust to the gloom. What they perceived in that moment of gradual illumination would become fixed in their memories with a clarity that would persist unchanged for the remainder of their lives. Reginald Pembroke, the village banker and a man of 65, lay sprawled across the Persian rug that dominated the center of the library floor. His face was the color of slate, his lips drawn back in what might have been a grimace of pain or might have been the final expression of shock. More disturbingly, there was a letter opener, an ornamental object fashioned to resemble a miniature sword, its handles set with what had been represented as rubies, though they were almost certainly paste, protruding from his left shoulder at an angle that suggested neither accident nor hesitation. The wound itself had produced remarkably little blood, which pooled beneath him in a quantity that seemed insufficient to account for his obvious death. Adrian made a sound that was halfway between a gasp and a cry, and his hand went to his mouth as if to prevent himself from being sick. Violet, who had been married to a physician for 43 years and had assisted him in his practice on numerous occasions, knelt beside the body with a composure that bordered on the clinical. She felt for a pulse, though her expression made clear that this was a formality, and turned to look at Adrian with eyes that had suddenly become very old. She said nothing, but her silence communicated what needed to be said. It was then that footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Margaret Thornfield appeared in the doorway with Constance behind her and, at the very rear, Miss Marple, who had followed the others from the drawing-room with the sort of unobtrusive persistence that made her arrival seem almost inevitable. The look on Margaret's face when she perceived the body was one of complete undisguised shock, and for a moment, just a moment, before she regained control, her composure fractured entirely. Her hand flew to her throat, and she made a small sound of distress. But it was not the shock of someone discovering the unexpected. Rather, it possessed the quality of shock at seeing a feared possibility transform into brutal reality. Miss Marple stood in the door. Her way, her grey eyes moving across the scene with methodical attention. She noted the position of the body, the letter opener, the drawn curtains, the arrangement of furniture that seemed undisturbed. She noted, too, the expression on Margaret Thornfield's face and the way Adrian was careful to position himself so that Constance could not observe his reaction. She noted the small, trembling sigh that escaped from Violet Carmichael's lips, and then she turned her attention to the spoon, which lay on the carpet near the body's outstretched hand, a silver teaspoon, identical to those in Margaret's Wedgwood tea service, its handle pointing toward the library door as if it had rolled there from some distant point of origin. The presence of the spoon registered in the minds of the assembled group with varying degrees of conscious awareness. Constance Thornfield noticed it first, her eyes drawn to the small metallic object by that peculiar human instinct that causes us to focus on the trivial when confronted with the overwhelming. She made a small noise, not quite a word, not quite a gasp, and pointed at it with one perfectly manicured finger. Margaret moved swiftly to intercept her nephew's wife before she could step further into the room, placing a restraining hand on her arm with a firmness that suggested generations of authority. Violet Carmichael, however, rose from her examination of the body with a movement that was both careful and decisive, her eyes narrowing as she regarded the spoon, with an expression that suggested recognition of some significance that eluded the others. She said nothing, but her lips pressed together in a thin line, and a small vertical furrow appeared between her eyebrows. The sound of the front door opening reverberated through the house, followed by the unmistakable tones of Inspector Hastings from the county police, who had apparently been summoned by Robert Ashford. During those few minutes when Margaret had left the drawing-room, the estate manager had, in fact, discovered the body while conducting his routine afternoon rounds, and it was he who had entered the library to investigate a door that he had found ajar, a door that the head housekeeper would later insist had been closed and locked when she had performed her morning dusting of the room. Hastings was a man of 56, with the solid bearing of someone who had spent nearly 30 years in police work without ever developing the particular intuition that separated adequate detectives from exceptional ones. He was competent, methodical, and possessed a tendency to seek out the obvious solution and pursue it with the determination of a dog with a bone. He arrived in the library with his constable, a young man named Davies, who possessed an admirable capacity for taking notes and an unfortunate weakness for motion sickness, and immediately took charge of the scene with the air of someone reclaiming territory that had been briefly usurped by amateurs. The body was identified with little difficulty as Reginald Pembroke, banker, widower, and resident of the village for the past 18 years. He had not, according to Margaret, been invited to the tea. This fact prompted Inspector Hastings to ask several questions in rapid succession regarding Mr. Pembroke's reason for being in the library and the manner in which he had gained access to the house. It was Robert Ashford who supplied the answer to the first question. Pembroke had sent word that he wished to discuss certain matters concerning the estate accounts with Margaret Thornfield, and had been shown into the library to wait while the tea party continued. As for the second question, the library possessed French doors that opened onto the terrace, doors that Pembroke might have used, though no one could confirm whether they had been locked or unlocked at the time of his supposed arrival. The spoon remained where it lay, and it was Miss Marple who, in her gentle and unassuming way, drew the inspector's attention to it. She moved toward the object with the hesitant steps of someone far older than her years, her hand trembling slightly as she gestured downward, and remarked in a voice barely above a whisper that it seemed a curious thing to find in the library, didn't it, as she had noticed all of Miss Thornfield's silver bore a rather distinctive hallmark. Hastings, who had a policeman's instinctive dismissal of elderly spinsters offering observations, nonetheless bent to examine the spoon, and noted that it did indeed appear to match the tea service in the drawing room. The implication seemed clear. Whoever had killed Reginald Pembroke had done so in haste and had inadvertently carried a piece of evidence back from the scene of the crime. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested with a delicate cough, they had taken it with them when they came to the library, which would suggest a certain premeditation, wouldn't it, as it was hardly the sort of object one carried absent-mindedly. Hastings, finding himself unexpectedly engaged in conversation with the village spinster, attempted to dismiss her with polite efficiency, and turned his attention instead to questioning the members of the household staff. It was during this process that several interesting facts emerged. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had indeed locked the library doors that morning, as was her standard practice. The butler, a man named Graves who had served the Thornfield family for 20 years, had not unlocked them at any point during the afternoon, though he could not swear to it with absolute certainty, as he had been occupied with his duties in other parts of the house. The footman, a nervous youth of 19 named Thomas, recalled seeing Mr. Pembroke arrive at approximately 3 o'clock and being instructed to show him to the library. The cook confirmed that she had heard nothing unusual until the screaming commenced at 4 o'clock, and the chambermaid, a girl named Susan, offered the curious observation that she had passed the library door at 3:30 and had heard 2 voices, a man's voice raised in what sounded like anger and a woman's voice that she could not quite identify. This last piece of information caused Inspector Hastings to straighten with renewed interest. A woman's voice. The implications were significant. He turned toward Margaret Thornfield and suggested, with the careful politeness that police officers employ when making accusations they cannot yet legally support, that perhaps Miss Thornfield had been in the library more recently than she had indicated. Margaret's face remained composed, but her fingers, which had been folded at her waist, began to work against one another in a small, betraying gesture. It was at this moment that Miss Marple, who had moved quietly to a corner of the library where she stood examining the arrangement of books on the shelves, murmured a soft observation regarding the peculiar fact that one of the volumes appeared to have been pulled from its place and not replaced, and how curious it was that the book's subject appeared to be a history of poison plants, particularly those native to England. The mention of poison produced an immediate and palpable shift in the atmosphere of the library, as though Miss Marple's observation had injected a substance into the air that altered its very composition. Inspector Hastings turned from Margaret Thornfield with the deliberation of a man whose investigative priorities were being reorganized before his eyes, and his gaze settled upon Miss Marple with an expression that suggested he was reassessing her in light of this new information. The letter opener, previously assumed to be the instrument of death, suddenly acquired additional significance. A poison-inflicted death would explain the relative absence of blood, the peculiar position of the body, and the curious fact that no one had heard sounds of struggle preceding the screaming. Hastings moved toward the bookshelf where Miss Marple stood, his movements suggesting a man who was beginning to suspect that the investigation might be considerably more complex than the simple case of passion or impulse that he had initially constructed. The volume in question lay at an angle on the shelf, its spine bearing the title A Compendium of Botanical Toxins, and when Hastings opened it, several pages fell naturally to sections dealing with plants that could be administered through food or drink without immediate detection. Adrian Thornfield had become very still, his earlier agitation replaced by a quality of frozen attention. Constance, observing her husband's reaction, had begun to display signs of genuine distress, her carefully maintained composure fragmenting into something approaching panic. Margaret remained motionless, her expression having settled into a mask of such complete control that it bordered on the inhuman. Violet Carmichael, having positioned herself near the doorway, watched the proceedings with the particular intensity of someone whose medical background allowed her to perceive implications that others might overlook. It was she who spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority. she said quietly and with evident reluctance, that she had noticed something upon her initial examination of the body that she had not mentioned to Inspector Hastings. The color of Mr. Pembroke's lips and the peculiar fixity of his pupils suggested the possibility of cyani. Depoisoning, which would produce precisely the symptoms they were observing, the relatively limited external bleeding, the rapid onset of unconsciousness, and the particular appearance of the facial features in death. The word cyanide seemed to hang in the library air like a visible thing, and its utterance prompted Hastings to issue immediate orders that the body be examined by a proper medical examiner and that the contents of the room be subjected to thorough investigation. Constance made a small sound of distress and began to move toward the doorway, but Adrian reached out and grasped her arm, his grip firm enough to prevent her escape. His eyes, when he looked at his wife, contained something that might have been warning or might have been accusation, the distinction between the two emotions being frequently obscure in moments of extreme stress. Margaret intervened with her characteristic authority, suggesting that they all withdraw from the library and allow the inspector to conduct his investigation unobstructed. This suggestion was received with evident relief by everyone except Adrian, whose resistance to the idea manifested in a rigidity of posture and a darkening of the eyes that suggested internal conflict of considerable magnitude. As the group filed out of the library, Miss Marple remained behind for a moment, her eyes moving across the scene with that peculiar quality of observation that characterized her engagement with the world. She noted the position of the chair near the window, which bore an indentation on its seat suggesting that someone had sat there for an extended period. She noted the desk, upon which lay several ledgers and papers relating to estate accounts, the papers arranged in a particular order that suggested they had been sorted by someone with a methodical mind. She noted the small silver dish on the mantelpiece, which appeared to have contained sweets or pastilles of some kind, though it was now empty save for a faint residue of powder. And she noted, with particular attention, the way that Adrian Thornfield had positioned himself in the doorway when he grasped his wife's arm, effectively blocking her exit and preventing her from fleeing the house. In the drawing room, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The teapot sat cold on the table, the delicate cups abandoned mid-sip, the cakes growing stale on their tiered stand. The other guests, the headmistress, the vicar's wife, the members of the horticultural society, had gravitated toward the windows, from which they could observe the arrival of additional police vehicles and the beginning of the more serious machinery of official investigation. Word was being sent throughout the village, spreading through the network of servants and gossips that traditionally constituted Little Ashford's primary communication system. By evening, every resident of the village would know that Reginald Pembroke had been murdered, almost certainly by poison, and that the crime had occurred within the walls of Thornfield Manor during Margaret Thornfield's autumn tea. The implications of this knowledge would ripple through the community like stones cast into still water, and by the time the initial shock had begun to settle, the speculation would have begun in earnest. Margaret Thornfield sat in the chair that had been hers throughout the tea, her posture as rigid as ever, but her hands betraying her through a small, continuous tremor. The room felt cold despite the afternoon warmth, and she became aware that she was staring at the space where Reginald Pembroke should have been sitting if he had been invited to the tea, which of course he had not been. And therein lay a truth that Margaret had no intention of revealing to the inspector or to anyone else. Adrian and Constance stood together near the fireplace, their proximity suggesting either unity or the performance of unity. And the distinction between these two possibilities would become increasingly significant as the investigation progressed. Outside, the pale golden light of afternoon was beginning to yield to the amber tones of early evening, and Miss Marple, having withdrawn from the library with quiet dignity, settled herself in a small chair in the corner of the drawing-room with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in a rhythm that suggested perfect calm, while her mind worked with the precision of a machine designed specifically for the discernment of human truth. The preliminary investigation, conducted over the course of the next 2 days, revealed a murder far more tangled in motive and opportunity than Inspector Hastings had initially suspected. The medical examiner confirmed Violet Carmichael's assessment, Reginald Pembroke had indeed been poisoned with cyanide, administered through the medium of the small silver dish that had been found on the mantelpiece. The residue proved to be crushed almonds mixed with traces of the poison, a combination that would have produced the characteristic almond scent of cyanide, while effectively masking its bitter taste. The letter opener, upon closer inspection, appeared to have been inserted post-mortem, a deliberate act of misdirection designed to suggest a crime of passion rather than premeditation. This revelation elevated the crime from one of impulse to one of calculated design, and it was this distinction that caused Inspector Hastings to regard the case with considerably more gravity than he had previously demonstrated. The question of how Reginald Pembroke had been induced to consume the poisoned almonds proved to be the critical interrogative that would dominate the investigation's trajectory. Hastings questioned E.A., CH member of the household staff, with meticulous attention to detail, and gradually a picture began to emerge of a man who had arrived at Thornfield Manor in a state of considerable agitation. Pembroke had apparently been engaged in a conversation with someone. The chambermaid Susan insisted she had heard a woman's voice, though she could not identify it with certainty, during which his tone had suggested anger or distress. The conversation had concluded at approximately 3:45, after which the library door had remained closed until the moment of the screaming. The question of who this woman might have been became the focal point of the investigation, and it was here that the social fabric of Little Ashford began to unravel in unexpected ways. Reginald Pembroke, it emerged through the careful questioning of various villagers, had possessed certain knowledge regarding financial irregularities within the Thornfield estate accounts. These irregularities, which amounted to several £1,000s, appeared to have been orchestrated over a period of years through the manipulation of invoices and the falsification of records. The person responsible for this manipulation appeared, upon cursory examination of the documents, to be Robert Ashford, the estate manager. However, upon more careful scrutiny, it became apparent that the falsifications bore the marks of someone with more sophisticated financial knowledge than Ashford possessed. This discovery prompted Hastings to widen his investigation to include Adrian Thornfield himself, whose business ventures had previously established him as a man of considerable financial acumen. Adrian, when confronted with this evidence, displayed none of the defensive posturing that one might expect from an accused man. Instead, he admitted freely that he had indeed been embezzling from the estate, and that Reginald Pembroke had discovered the scheme through his examination of the accounts. Constance, upon hearing this confession, made a small sound of shock that seemed to belie any prior knowledge of her husband's financial crimes. Adrian's explanation for his actions centered on business losses incurred through unfortunate investments, losses that had threatened to bankrupt him entirely until the prospect of accessing his aunt's considerable wealth had presented itself as a solution. He had intended to replace the stolen funds once his financial situation had stabilized, but Pembroke's discovery had accelerated a timeline that Adrian had not yet determined how to manage. This confession, while it provided a clear motive for Adrian to wish Reginald Pembroke dead, did not entirely resolve the question of how the poisoning had been executed. Adrian insisted, with what appeared to be genuine conviction, that he had not been in the library at the time of Pembroke's death. He had remained in the drawing room throughout the afternoon, engaging in conversation with the other guests and his wife. Constance confirmed this account, her voice carrying the particular strain that accompanies the provision of an alibi for a person one is not entirely certain of. Yet the chambermaid Susan had heard a woman's voice in the library, and this fact seemed to point away from Adrian and toward one of the female members of the household or the visiting guests. Miss Marple, observing these developments from her position at the periphery of events, noted several significant details that appeared to escape the inspector's attention. She observed the manner in which Margaret Thornfield's eyes frequently sought out the portrait of Sir Edmund that hung above the fireplace, as if consulting with her deceased husband regarding the proper course of action in this unprecedented crisis. She observed the particular quality of relief that had manifested in Robert Ashford's face when Adrian had admitted to the embezzlement, as though a burden he had been carrying for some time had suddenly been lifted. She observed the way that Violet Carmichael had positioned herself in the drawing room so that she could observe Adrian Thornfield's reactions to the inspector's questions, her expression suggesting that she was engaged in a form of assessment that extended beyond mere curiosity. And she observed, with particular attention, the small scar on Constance Thornfield's left wrist, visible only when the woman moved her arm in a particular manner, a scar that bore the distinctive characteristics of an old burn, the kind that might be sustained through contact with boiling water or another heated substance. On the second evening of the investigation, as the household prepared for dinner, a meal that was to be served despite the ongoing police presence, as Margaret remained firmly committed to the maintenance of standards in all circumstances, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Hastings. This request was granted with something approaching reluctance, as Hastings had developed a habit of finding the elderly spinster's observations either frustratingly oblique or, worse, uncomfortably prescient. She suggested to him, in her gentle and circuitous manner, that he might wish to inquire regarding the movements of each household member, not at the moment of the murder, but at the moment approximately 15 minutes prior, when the conversation in the library had been overheard by Susan. Hastings, whose investigative instincts had begun to atrophy under the weight of Adrian's seemingly complete confession, found his attention sharpening at this suggestion. He thanked Miss Marple with the civility of a man who had learned not to dismiss the apparently insignificant, and made a mental note to pursue this line of questioning with renewed vigor. Outside, the evening had grown dark, and the village of Little Ashford settled into that peculiar quality of quietness that descends upon communities touched by violent death, a stillness that carries within it the knowledge that something fundamental has shifted, and that return to previous innocence is no longer possible. Renewed questioning of the household members regarding their precise locations at 3:45 in the afternoon produced results that were, at first glance, remarkably unhelpful. Margaret Thornfield had been in the drawing room, as had Adrian and Constance. Violet Carmichael had been present as well, engaged in conversation with the headmistress regarding a recent donation to the village school. The other guests had been distributed throughout the room, visible to one another, their alibis effectively corroborating one another's accounts. The household staff, when questioned, provided equally consistent testimonies. Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, had been in the servants' quarters attending to a minor domestic matter. Graves, the butler, had been polishing silver in the pantry. Thomas, the footman, had been preparing the second pot of tea in the kitchen. And Susan, the chambermaid, had been delivering fresh linens to the guest bedrooms on the second floor, which placed her in proximity to the library, but not within it. Yet it was this very consistency that began to trouble Inspector Hastings as the investigation progressed into its third day. He found himself possessed of a growing conviction that the accounts he was receiving were not so much honest testimonies as they were carefully constructed narratives, rehearsed and refined to present a unified front against external scrutiny. This suspicion was reinforced when he discovered, through patient questioning of the cook, that the second pot of tea had actually been prepared at 3 o'clock, not at the moment when Margaret had requested it following her private conversation with Robert Ashford. This discrepancy, while seemingly minor, suggested that Thomas the footman had been engaged in something other than tea preparation during the critical period when Reginald Pembroke had been conversing with his mysterious female companion. Hastings brought Thomas in for further questioning, and the young man, under the weight of the inspector's sustained attention, eventually broke down and admitted that he had not been in the kitchen at 3:45. Instead, he had been in the library, having been summoned there by someone he had not been able to identify with certainty. A woman had sent word through the butler that she required assistance with something in the library, a book that had fallen or some similar pretext, and he had gone to assist. When he had entered the room, he had found Mr. Pembroke standing near the mantelpiece, and a woman with her back to him, dressed in the grey dress that was worn by the chambermaid. Thinking it was Susan, he had begun to withdraw, but the woman had turned slightly, and in that moment he had realized it was not the chambermaid at all, but someone else. He had been too startled and confused to identify her with certainty, and he had left the library immediately, feeling that he had stumbled upon something that was not his concern. The revelation that someone had deliberately disguised themselves in a chambermaid's dress to gain access to the library produced a profound shift in the investigation's trajectory. Inspector Hastings found himself contemplating a murder that had involved considerably more planning and forethought than Adrian Thornfield's embezzlement scheme alone could have generated. Someone had possessed the knowledge that Pembroke would be in the library at a particular time. Someone had prepared the poisoned almonds in advance, and someone had employed elaborate misdirection to ensure that suspicion would fall upon the most obvious candidate, a man with a clear financial motive to wish the banker dead. This revelation prompted Hastings to request additional assistance from Scotland Yard, and by the fourth morning of the investigation, a more senior detective had arrived at Thornfield Manor to provide consultation on a case that had begun to reveal itself as considerably more complex than the preliminary evidence had suggested. It was this newcomer, Detective Inspector Llewellyn, a man of Welsh descent with a reputation for perceiving patterns that eluded his less experienced colleagues, who suggested to Hastings that the embezzlement scheme itself might have been a deliberate fabrication designed to direct suspicion toward Adrian Thornfield and away from the true perpetrator. This suggestion prompted a complete re-examination of the estate accounts, and under Llewellyn's guidance, it became apparent that while financial irregularities did indeed exist, they were far less extensive than the initial investigation had indicated. The majority of the falsifications had been perpetrated by Pembroke himself, who had been engaged in a scheme to extract funds from the Thornfield estate through the manipulation of payment records and the creation of fictitious vendors. Adrian Thornfield, it appeared, had discovered this scheme and had attempted to conceal it, not out of guilt, but out of a desire to protect his aunt from the knowledge that her trusted banker had been systematically robbing her. Confession that Adrian had made regarding his own embezzlement appeared, under this new light, to have been a deliberate act of self-sacrifice, an attempt to shield the true villain from discovery by accepting blame for crimes that he had not committed. This revelation produced an almost immediate transformation in the household's atmosphere. Margaret, upon learning that Adrian had been protecting her interests rather than betraying them, underwent a visible softening of her previously rigid composure. Constance, meanwhile, experienced what appeared to be a surge of genuine affection for her husband, her hand seeking his with a quality of touch that suggested authentic emotion rather than the performative gesture of the previous days. Yet Detective Inspector Llewellyn remained unconvinced that the investigation had reached its proper conclusion. He requested access to examine more thoroughly the movements of each household member during the critical period, paying particular attention to the servants' quarters and the upper floors of the house. It was during this examination that Miss Marple quietly approached him and mentioned, in her characteristically oblique manner, that she had noticed something peculiar about the way that Margaret Thornfield had dismissed her lady's maid immediately following Pembroke's death, sending the woman away to visit a sister in the neighboring county. The dismissal had been presented as a temporary arrangement, but Miss Marple had observed that the woman's wages had been paid in full for 3 months in advance, and that Margaret had provided her with additional funds for travelling expenses, an extraordinary generosity that seemed, in Miss Marple's gentle estimation, to suggest something more akin to compensation than mere employment termination. Detective Inspector Llewellyn received Miss Marple's observation with the respect that a man of genuine investigative acumen accords to the perceptive observations of those who have spent a lifetime studying human nature. He immediately requested that Hastings initiate a telegraph to the neighboring county to locate Margaret Thornfield's Lady S-maid, a woman named Eleanor Cross, who had served the Thornfield household for the past 8 years within hours. Eleanor had been located and persuaded, through the combined efforts of the local constabulary and the promise of protection, to return to Little Ashford and provide a full account of her involvement in the events surrounding Reginald Pembroke's death. What emerged from Eleanor's testimony was a narrative that recontextualized everything that had preceded it. Margaret Thornfield had indeed been aware of the embezzlement scheme, not through Adrian's discovery, but through her own careful examination of the household accounts, work that she had conducted in private, with the assistance and advice of her lady's maid, a woman of considerable intelligence and discretion. When Margaret had become certain of Pembroke's guilt, she had been faced with a dilemma of profound moral complexity. Exposing the banker would have meant not only public scandal for the Thornfield family, but also the revelation that Margaret herself had been duped by a man she had trusted implicitly for nearly 2 decades. More significantly, it would have meant the destruction of Adrian's reputation, as Pembroke had constructed his scheme in such a manner as to implicate the younger man in the embezzlement. Rather than allow her nephew to face ruin, Margaret had made a decision that Eleanor described with evident reluctance and clear moral distress. She had arranged a meeting with Pembroke in the library, ostensibly to confront him regarding the financial irregularities. Eleanor, following Margaret's explicit instructions, had prepared the poisoned almonds, crushing cyanide into the confection with the careful precision of someone carrying out a task she found morally repugnant, but felt compelled to execute. The poison had been selected, Eleanor explained, because it would act swiftly and would leave minimal external evidence of its administration. When Pembroke arrived for his appointment with Margaret, he had been offered refreshment, the poisoned almonds presented in the silver dish, and he had consumed them without apparent suspicion. The conversation that followed had been overheard by the chambermaid Susan, though the words themselves had not been sufficiently distinct to allow for comprehension. Margaret had apparently confronted Pembroke regarding his crimes, had perhaps even offered him an opportunity to flee the country with sufficient funds to establish himself elsewhere, a generosity born of her desire to contain the scandal rather than expose it to public scrutiny. Pembroke had refused, his pride apparently affronted at the suggestion that he should flee. He had instead become increasingly agitated, his voice rising as he denied the accusations and demanded that Margaret cease her insinuations regarding his financial integrity. The poisoning had taken effect within minutes, the cyanide acting with the swift lethality for which it was notorious. Pembroke had collapsed, and Margaret, following what read to have been a prearranged plan, had inserted the letter opener into his shoulder and had immediately summoned Eleanor to assist in creating the impression that the crime had been one of passion rather than premeditation. Eleanor had changed into Susan's dress, had retrieved the spoon from Margaret's tea service, an object that Margaret had deliberately taken into the library as a form of calling card, a subtle signature that would eventually lead investigators to the truth, and had departed the house through the French doors, which had been left unlocked for precisely that purpose. Upon hearing this account, Detective Inspector Llewellyn found himself in the position of possessing irrefutable proof of Margaret Thornfield's guilt in the death of Reginald Pembroke. The confession of her lady's maid, corroborated by the physical evidence and by the peculiar details that only someone present at the crime could have known, constituted an airtight case against the matriarch of the Thornfield household. Yet Llewellyn discovered himself possessed of a profound reluctance to proceed with an arrest. The crime, while unquestionably a violation of the law, possessed a quality of complexity that resisted simple moral judgment. Margaret Thornfield had killed to protect her family from ruin. She had acted not out of personal greed or vindictive impulse, but out of a misguided sense of loyalty and familial obligation. Eleanor Cross had participated in the crime not because she desired to commit murder, but because she believed herself bound by an obligation to the woman who had employed her and treated her with considerable kindness over the years. Neither woman could be easily characterized as a villain in the conventional sense, yet neither could escape the fundamental fact that they had deliberately administered poison to a man and had conspired to conceal their crime. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, who had maintained her quiet observation of events throughout the investigation, requested a final private conversation with Detective Inspector Llewellyn. They met in the small parlor adjacent to the drawing room, and Miss Marple, having settled herself in a chair with her knitting as though they were about to engage in an ordinary social visit, began to speak. Her words, delivered in her characteristic gentle manner, addressed not the question of guilt or innocence, but rather the deeper question of what justice truly meant in a case where law and morality had diverged so fundamentally. She spoke of villages and small communities, of the ways in which human beings were bound together by ties of kinship and obligation that existed beneath the surface of law. She spoke of the nature of punishment, and whether the imposition of legal consequence upon a woman who had acted out of love for her family, however misguided that action had been, could properly be said to constitute justice. She did not argue that Margaret should escape consequences for her actions, but she suggested, with all the delicate precision of someone accustomed to careful speech, that perhaps there existed alternatives to the prison cell and the gallows. Detective Inspector Llewellyn listened to Miss Marple's observations with the attention that a man accustomed to the weight of difficult decisions gives to suggestions that touch upon the very boundaries of his professional obligation. When she had concluded, he sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers steepled before his face, his eyes directed towards some point beyond the walls of the parlor. He did not immediately respond to her suggestions, but rather asked a question that seemed, upon its surface, entirely tangential to the matter at hand. He inquired whether Miss Marple believed that Margaret Thornfield had acted with genuine premeditation, or whether the poisoning had been, in some fundamental sense, an act of desperation undertaken in the moment when Pembroke had refused the opportunity to escape. Miss Marple, setting down her knitting with deliberate care, replied that this was precisely the question that troubled the conscience, wasn't it? The preparation of the poisoned almonds suggested premeditation, certainly, but the insertion of the letter opener appeared to have been a last minute improvisation, undertaken when the original plan, which may well have involved the appearance of accidental death, had begun to unravel. Pembroke's refusal to accept Margaret's proposed solution had forced her to improvise, to create the appearance of a crime of passion in place of the carefully orchestrated plan she had originally envisioned. This distinction, while perhaps seeming minor to those unfamiliar with the law, might prove significant to a jury that had to determine the degree of culpability involved in her actions. Llewellyn rose and moved to the window, from which he could observe the gardens of Thornfield Manor, where autumn had begun its inevitable transformation of the landscape into subtle shades of amber and rust. He spoke, after a prolonged silence, regarding the nature of his position as a detective. He explained that he had spent 23 years in the service of justice, had seen men and women, both guilty and innocent, pass through the machinery of law, and had become increasingly convinced that the law itself was a blunt instrument, capable of crude justice but rarely of true wisdom. He had also become aware, through hard experience, that the most dangerous criminals were frequently those who acted out of genuine conviction that their actions were justified, while those most deserving of mercy were often those who had violated the law out of love or despair. Ration rather than malice. He turned back to face Miss Marple and asked whether she truly believed that allowing Margaret Thornfield to escape legal consequence would constitute justice, or whether it would merely represent a failure of the legal system to fulfill its proper function. Miss Marple's response was characteristically measured. She acknowledged that the law had a purpose and a function that could not be arbitrarily set aside, even in cases where compassion seemed to demand it. However, she suggested that the law itself possessed flexibility, that prosecutors were empowered to exercise discretion in deciding what charges to bring, the judges possessed latitude in sentencing, and that the formal machinery of justice was not entirely immovable if a man of sufficient authority chose to exercise his will in a particular direction. She did not argue that Margaret should escape all consequence, but rather that perhaps a course existed that would balance the demands of justice with the recognition that human motivation was invariably more complex than simple categories of guilt and innocence could encompass. Over the course of the following week, a resolution began to emerge that satisfied, if not the letter of the law, then at least its broader spirit. Charges were brought against Margaret Thornfield, not for murder, but for manslaughter, a distinction that reflected the investigation's conclusion that while she had deliberately administered poison, the premeditation required for a conviction on the more serious charge could not be conclusively established. Eleanor Cross entered a plea of guilty to charges of conspiracy and accessory after the fact, and her cooperation in providing testimony against Margaret was recognized in the sentencing. The trial itself, conducted before a judge who had been subtly influenced by Detective Inspector Llewellyn's detailed rapport. regarding the circumstances of the crime, proceeded with a particular quality of restraint. The prosecution made its case, the evidence was presented, and the jury, consisting of 12 men drawn from the village and surrounding areas, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. However, in the sentencing phase, the judge took considerable time to address the circumstances that had motivated Margaret's actions, acknowledging her previous unblemished character, her evident remorse, and the complex moral situation that had confronted her when she had discovered Pembroke's theft. He imposed a sentence of 12 years' imprisonment, a substantial penalty that nonetheless reflected the court's recognition that her crime, while serious, was not equivalent to the calculated murder of a stranger undertaken for personal gain. Eleanor Cross received a sentence of 5 years and was assured that her cooperation and her obvious moral distress regarding her participation in the crime would be taken into account when considering questions of early release. The village of Little Ashford received these verdicts with a complex mixture of emotions. There was a sense of relief that the mystery had been solved and that the machinery of justice had been set in motion. There was also, however, a pervasive sadness that Margaret Thornfield, a woman who had been the social and moral center of the community for decades, would spend her remaining years imprisoned for an act that, however illegal, had been motivated by loyalty to her family rather than personal malice. Adrian Thornfield, his reputation restored through the revelation of his uncle's embezzlement scheme, established himself in London and attempted to rebuild his life and his marriage. Though observers noted that the bond between Adrian and Constance had been fundamentally altered by the events they had endured together. The household at Thornfield Manor fell under the management of Adrian's younger brother, who arrived from India to take up residence and attempt to restore the estate to its former glory, though the house itself seemed diminished by Margaret's absence, as though some essential element of its character had departed with her. It was approximately 6 months following Margaret Thornfield's sentencing that Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage in Little Ashford, a visitor whose arrival she seemed to have anticipated with the sort of quiet certainty that characterized all of her interactions with the world. Detective Inspector Llewellyn, having concluded his official business in the county and having been reassigned to other cases demanding his attention, had made a point of calling upon the elderly spinster to express his gratitude for her contributions to the investigation. He found her in her garden, despite the chill of early spring, tending to the seedlings that she had begun in anticipation of the growing season. She did not appear surprised by his arrival, but rather greeted him with the courtesy of someone welcoming an expected guest, and invited him to sit upon the bench that overlooked her modest rose garden. Llewellyn, settling himself beside her with the careful movements of a man whose occupation had made him aware of the fragility that age could impose upon the human frame, began by expressing his professional admiration for her investigative intuitions. He acknowledged that, without her observations regarding the lady's maid and the peculiar nature of Margaret's behavior, the case might well have concluded with Adrian Thornfield imprisoned for a crime he had not committed. Miss Marple received these compliments with the modest deflection that characterized all of her responses to praise. She suggested that she had merely observed what any attentive person might have noticed had they possessed the leisure to do so. The difference, she explained, was that she had spent her entire life observing the ways of human nature within the confines of a small village, and had learned through long experience that the most significant truths were invariably hidden beneath layers of social convention and careful presentation. When one had witnessed human behavior in all of its variety and complexity across decades, certain patterns became apparent that might otherwise escape notice. Llewellyn, nodding slowly, asked a question that had apparently troubled him throughout the preceding months. He inquired whether Miss Marple believed that Margaret Thornfield had been properly served by justice, or whether the legal machinery had ultimately failed both the victim and the perpetrator. Miss Marple set down her trowel with deliberate care and considered the question with the seriousness that such an inquiry deserved. She acknowledged that the answer was not simple, and that her response might appear to contradict the support she had ostensibly provided for the investigation. She explained that justice, as administered by law, was necessarily impersonal and general in its application. It could not account for the infinite variations of human circumstance and motivation that characterized actual crimes. Yet law was also necessary, because without it, society dissolved into chaos where the powerful preyed upon the weak with impunity. What troubled her, she continued, was not the verdict that had been reached, but rather the gap between what the law could accomplish and what true justice might have demanded. Margaret Thornfield had committed a crime, had violated the law, and had deservedly been punished. Yet the punishment itself could not undo the harm that had been caused, could not restore Reginald Pembroke to Lee. Fay could not prevent the suffering that Margaret's imprisonment had inflicted upon Adrian and Constance and the household staff who had served her faithfully. In an ideal world, she suggested, justice would have encompassed not merely punishment, but also the restoration of relationships, the healing of wounds, and the reintegration of the offender into society with the opportunity to demonstrate genuine reformation. The law, however, was not equipped to accomplish these things, and so it settled for the cruder instrument of incarceration. Llewellyn listened to this meditation with evident appreciation, and he shared with Miss Marple information that had come to his attention through his continued contacts within the prison system. Margaret Thornfield had conducted herself with considerable dignity during her months of imprisonment. She had established herself as a teacher within the prison, instructing other inmates in reading and mathematics, and had become a figure of moral authority within the institution despite her status as a prisoner. The wardens and administrators had noted that her presence seemed to exert a stabilizing influence upon the more volatile elements of the population, and there had been suggestions, as yet informal, that her sentence might be considered for reduction in recognition of her exemplary conduct and her contributions to the reform of other prisoners. Miss Marple received this information with a small, satisfied nod, as though it confirmed something that she had intuited from the beginning. She observed that this outcome seemed to her to represent a form of justice that the legal system itself could not have engineered, but which human nature, given appropriate circumstances, seemed capable of producing. Margaret's punishment had been real and had been substantial, yet her character remained fundamentally intact, and her capacity for oral action had survived the degradation of imprisonment. This suggested, Miss Marple reflected, that perhaps true justice was not primarily a matter of legal mechanisms, but rather of allowing human beings the opportunity to demonstrate whether they possessed the moral resources to respond to punishment with growth rather than with bitterness. Llewellyn rose to depart, and as he prepared to take his leave, he asked one final question. He inquired whether Miss Marple felt any regret regarding her role in bringing about Margaret's downfall, whether she questioned whether her observational acuity might have been better employed in remaining silent and allowing Adrian to bear the consequences of a crime he had not committed. Miss Marple's response was immediate and unambiguous. She explained that to remain silent in the face of injustice would have been itself a form of moral failure. While she regretted the suffering that her actions had caused Margaret and her family, she could not have done otherwise without betraying her fundamental conviction that truth, however difficult and however painful its revelation, was preferable to comfortable deception. The alternative to Margaret's trial would not have been peace and harmony, but rather the slow corruption that comes from the successful concealment of crime, from the knowledge that guilt had been evaded, and from the erosion of trust that accompanies the awareness that truth has been deliberately suppressed. As Llewellyn walked back toward the village, passing through the lanes that had become familiar to him during his months of investigation, he found himself contemplating the nature of Miss Marple's wisdom. She had not solved the crime through the application of superior forensic knowledge or through the manipulation of evidence, but rather through the patient observation of human behavior and the recognition that in a community as interconnected as a village, significant truths could rarely be concealed forever. 2 years following the conclusion of the investigation into Reginald Pembroke's death, the village of Little Ashford had settled into a condition of equilibrium that bore only faint traces of the upheaval that had so dramatically disrupted its previous tranquility. The scandal had faded, as all scandals eventually do, into the comfortable haze of village history, relegated to the category of events that were discussed in hushed tones and with a quality of circumspection that suggested the community had reached an unspoken consensus regarding the limits of what ought to be publicly examined. Life had resumed its customary rhythms, though certain absences were keenly felt and certain relationships had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered by the events that had unfolded within the walls of Thornfield Manor. Adrian Thornfield had divorced his wife and had established himself in London as a man of considerable financial success, his business ventures having prospered once he had been freed from the burden of managing the Thornfield estate. His younger brother, Edward, had proven himself an adequate administrator of the household, though observers noted that Thornfield Manor never entirely recovered the social preeminence it had enjoyed under Margaret's stewardship. Eleanor Cross had been released from prison after serving 4 years of her sentence, recognition of her cooperation and her demonstration of genuine moral transformation having influenced the authorities to grant her early release. She had taken a position as a housekeeper in a respectable household in the neighboring county, where she had conducted herself with such discretion and propriety that few of her employers were aware of her previous history. The wages that Margaret Thornfield had arranged for her had been supplemented by Adrian, who had developed a sense of obligation toward the woman who had sacrificed her freedom to protect his family's reputation. Violet Carmichael, the physician's widow, had passed away in the autumn following the trial, her death attributed to a decline in health that observers suggested had been hastened by the moral distress she had experienced regarding her knowledge of the crime. Her will had made substantial bequests to the village school and to the church, suggesting that even in her final months, she had been preoccupied with the question of how one might atone for the knowledge of wrongdoing that one had acquired but had not prevented. The vicar had delivered a eulogy that carefully avoided any reference to the trial or to the events that had culminated in Pembroke's death, focusing instead upon Violet's long years of charitable service and her commitment to the moral improvement of the community. It was during the autumn of this second year that Miss Marple received a letter from Holloway Prison, where Margaret Thornfield had been transferred following the completion of her trial. The letter was written in a careful, measured script, and its contents suggested that Margaret had spent considerable time in its composition, weighing each word with the precision of someone unaccustomed to expressing profound emotion through the medium of written language. Margaret expressed her gratitude to Miss Marple for the role that the elderly spinster had played in ensuring the truth had been revealed, a gratitude that seemed to extend beyond the conventional politeness of such expressions. She acknowledged that she had initially viewed Miss Marple's observations with resentment, had experienced her as an instrument of destruction that had brought ruin upon the household that Margaret had devoted her life to maintaining and protecting. However, she had come, through the extended period of her imprisonment and through the work of moral reflection that such confinement had enforced upon her, to understand that truth, however painful, was preferable to the comfortable deception in which she had been living. She had convinced herself, she wrote, that her actions were justified by familial loyalty, that the protection of Adrian's reputation and the preservation of the Thornfield name justified the murder of a man who had, after all, been engaged in his own form of criminal activity. Yet imprisonment had taught her that this justification was itself a form of moral blindness, a rationalization that allowed her to evade responsibility for the fundamental fact that she had taken a human life. She had come to recognize, through the passage of months and through her work with other inmates, that the law which had imprisoned her was not a mere mechanical instrument of social control, but rather an expression of a moral order that extended beyond individual families and particular loyalties. To violate the law in service of family was still to violate the law, and to justify one's violation through appeals to particular circumstances was to invite a moral chaos in which the strong would invariably prey upon the weak. The letter concluded with an expression of hope that Miss Marple might, at some point, find it within herself to visit the prison and to engage in conversation regarding the nature of justice and the moral education that she had been undergoing. Miss Marple received this letter with evident emotion, though she spoke of it to no one in the village. Instead, she made arrangements to visit Holloway Prison on a date of her own choosing, and she travelled to London for this purpose in the company of her nephew, a clergyman of considerable learning and sensitivity. The meeting between Miss Marple and Margaret, too. Okay place in the visitors' room of the prison. Austere space furnished with wooden chairs and a long table that separated the imprisoned from the free. Margaret, when she entered the room, bore little physical resemblance to the imperious matriarch who had presided over the autumn tea 2 years previously. Her hair had grayed further, her posture had become more stooped, and her eyes possessed a quality of inward reflection that suggested she had journeyed through a profound transformation. Yet her face, when she smiled in greeting at Miss Marple, possessed a serenity that had been absent in the woman who had orchestrated the murder of Reginald Pembroke. The conversation that passed between them was never fully disclosed to anyone outside that room, though Miss Marple's nephew noted that his aunt emerged from the prison with an expression of profound peace, as though some burden that she had been carrying had been set down. It was not until several months later, when Miss Marple was visited once again by Detective Inspector Llewellyn, that she provided any indication of the substance of her conversation with Margaret Thornfield. She explained in her characteristically oblique manner that she had come to the conclusion that the true purpose of law was not primarily punishment, but rather the creation of a space in which genuine moral reflection and transformation could occur. Margaret Thornfield, she suggested, had been given precisely what she needed, not revenge against her, but rather an enforced opportunity to confront the consequences of her actions and to develop a deeper understanding of the moral order that her crime had violated. In that sense, the law had served its true function, had accomplished something far more valuable than the mere extraction of retribution. 5 years after the death of Reginald Pembroke, little Ashford had transformed into a commune. Nitty that bore the marks of its experience without being defined entirely by it. The incident had become what all dramatic events eventually become in village life, part of the collective history, referenced occasionally in moments of particular poignancy, but generally consigned to that realm of past occurrences that shaped character without dominating present consciousness. Miss Marple, now in her 76th year, had settled more deeply into her role as the village's unofficial repository of moral wisdom, a function she performed with such subtlety that few residents were consciously aware of how frequently they found themselves seeking her counsel on matters both great and small. She had maintained her correspondence with Margaret Thornfield, who was now eligible for parole consideration, and who had submitted a formal request that Miss Marple serve as a character witness in the proceedings. The parole hearing, conducted in a small room at Holloway Prison, proceeded with a formality that belied the profound questions it was ultimately addressing. The magistrate who presided over the hearing was a man of considerable judicial experience, and he had reviewed the case file with evident care, noting the initial crime, the trial, and the remarkable record of Margaret's conduct during her 5 years of imprisonment. Miss Marple, seated in the witness chair, presented a testimony that was remarkable chiefly for its refusal to minimize Margaret's culpability while simultaneously acknowledging the profound transformation that she had undergone. She explained to the magistrate that in her 76 years of life she had observed that human beings possessed a remarkable capacity for both moral blindness and moral growth, and that Margaret Thornfield had demonstrated both of these capacities with considerable clarity. She had been, Miss Marple testified, a woman of genuine, nay conviction regarding her moral obligations to her family, yet this very conviction had blinded her to the moral obligations that extended beyond familial ties to encompass the broader human community. Her imprisonment, rather than merely punishing her for this moral failure, had provided her with an opportunity to develop a more expansive understanding of ethical responsibility, and she had seized that opportunity with a seriousness of purpose that deserved recognition. The magistrate, after deliberating for a period of several hours, announced his decision to grant Margaret Thornfield parole, conditional upon her continued good conduct and her commitment to community service work. The conditions imposed were substantial, and they reflected the magistrate's awareness that while Margaret had demonstrated genuine reformation, she remained a woman who had committed a serious crime and who must therefore be subject to ongoing supervision and constraint. Margaret was released on a grey afternoon in early autumn, exactly 5 years to the season from the moment when the screaming had erupted from the library at Thornfield Manor. She did not return to the village immediately, but rather took up residence in a modest flat in London, where she established herself as a woman of modest means, engaged in charitable work among the poor and the imprisoned. She volunteered at a prison education program, where her experience as an inmate provided her with particular insight into the psychology of those incarcerated. She worked in a hospital that served the impoverished sections of the city, where her organizational abilities and her moral authority proved invaluable in the management of complex social situations. And she maintained her correspondence with Miss Marple, letters that grew increasingly reflective and profound as the years progressed. It was not until a full decade after the original crime that Margaret Thornfield made a journey back to Little Ashford to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law, Edward, who had managed Thornfield Manor for the preceding years. The village had changed subtly in her absence, though the fundamental character of the place remained unaltered. The tea shops and the church and the lanes lined with cottage gardens were all as she remembered them, though she passed through these familiar spaces as a stranger, or more precisely, as a ghost haunting the scenes of her former life. She attended the funeral service with quiet dignity, and afterward she walked to Miss Marple's cottage, where she knew the elderly spinster would be expecting her. The meeting between the two women was characterized by a profound simplicity. They sat together in Miss Marple's garden, in the same location where Detective Inspector Llewellyn had conversed with the elderly detective years before, and they discussed not the crime or the trial or the years of imprisonment, but rather the nature of human redemption and the possibility of genuine moral transformation. Margaret explained that she had come to understand that her crime had not been merely a violation of law, but a violation of the fundamental human community that bound all people together in networks of mutual obligation and care. To poison a man, regardless of his own moral failings, was to assert that her own judgment regarding his worthiness to live was superior to the judgment of the broader community. It was to place herself above law, above morality, above the basic human constraint that prevented the strong from preying upon the weak. Her imprisonment and her subsequent work among the marginalized and the imprisoned had taught her that this constraint was not merely a restriction imposed upon her, but rather a recognition of her fundamental interdependence with all other human beings. She had learned, through hard experience, that she could not separate herself from the broader human community, that her actions rippled outward in ways she could not control or predict, and that genuine moral agency consisted not in the assertion of individual will, but in the recognition of one's responsibilities to others. Miss Marple listened to these reflections with the particular quality of attention that she brought to all human communication, and when Margaret had concluded, she observed simply that this understanding seemed to her to constitute a form of wisdom that could only have been purchased at considerable cost. The cost, Margaret acknowledged, had been her freedom, her reputation, and the loss of her position within the community that she had served for so many years. Yet she had come to believe that this cost was not too high, that the wisdom she had acquired through her suffering represented genuine gain that compensated, in some measure, for what she had lost. As the afternoon light began its descent toward evening, casting the familiar golden rectangles across the garden, Miss Marple rose and moved into her cottage to prepare tea. When she returned, she carried with her a silver teapot and 2 delicate cups of Wedgwood china, the very pattern that had graced Margaret's table during that autumn afternoon so many years before. She poured the tea with deliberate care, and she placed a silver spoon beside each cup, a small gesture that seemed to acknowledge the full circle that the two women had traveled from the moment when a single spoon had lain abandoned on a library carpet to this moment of reconciliation and understanding. The tea cooled slowly in the gathering dusk, and the two women sat in companionable silence, having said all that truly needed to be said, having arrived at that understanding that transcends language and STS in the realm of shared human experience and mutual recognition of both fallibility and the capacity for growth. In the distance, the church bells tolled the hour, marking the passage of time in a village where the rhythms of life continued as they always had and always would. measured by seasons and customs, and the slow accumulation of human stories that constituted the true substance of community.